Papyrus woke up the next morning to find Undyne had already been and gone. 5 a.m. He'd slept in. Atop the bundle she had left in front of the door was a teasing note, so at least he hadn't angered her by sleeping so late. Undyne had been thoughtful enough to give him 2 padded gambesons to wear, and she picked out the smallest pieces of armor available, but it was still meant for monsters with flesh. He was in the process of punching extra holes in the straps when Sans shuffled downstairs, still wearing yesterday's clothes and looking even more rumpled than usual. It was only 9 o'clock, so by Sans' standard time his brother was up early. He mumbled something that may have been a greeting and trudged into the kitchen, returning with a glass of water and a piece of dry toast a few minutes later. He sat down across from Papyrus at the table and gingerly nibbled at the toast. "You're up early," Papyrus said, looking up from his work for a moment. Sans chuckled, spraying toast crumbs onto the tabletop. "Headache woke me up. Partied a little too hearty, I guess." He took a sip of water. "What I don't get is how you're always fine even though you drink maybe twice a year. I'm kinda jealous." "I'm in much better shape than you are, if you hadn't noticed." His head did hurt a little. That last round of fire shots had been ill-advised, but it was easy enough to ignore. Sans laughed and promptly winced. Jeez, it's like hammers on my skull." He took another small sip of water. "Believe me, bro, I'm well aware. You're in shape. I'm... shapes." That was something that could be fixed easily enough, but Papyrus let that argument go for once. Instead, he got back to work on the straps. "Is that your new kit?" "Yes," Papyrus said. "Undyne dropped it off this morning." He twisted the awl he was using through a particularly stubborn piece of leather. Modifying the straps was taking forever. But he couldn't have the plates twisting around on him when he moved. "She sure doesn't waste any time." "No, some people don't." Papyrus was getting irritated. He didn't know why, and he felt bad about it, so he just stopped talking before he said something needlessly mean. Sans watched him work for a few minutes, finishing off the toast. He hadn't used a plate, no great surprise there, and there was a small collection of crumbs on his side of the table in addition to what he'd spread while talking with his mouth full. Nothing unusual, but it was getting Papyrus all the same. "You're awfully quiet. You okay, bro?" Papyrus didn't look up. "You have a hangover." With the last hole punched in the last piece that needed it, he started the slightly daunting task of putting it all on. Sans came around the table to help once Papyrus got to the breastplate and gorget. It was tricky business trying to buckle the straps behind his own back. He knelt so Sans could reach easier. "Come to think of it," Sans said, pointing the first of the pauldrons onto Papyrus's shoulders, since that was pretty difficult to do one-handed. "You've been quiet for a few weeks now." He frowned, tugging on one of the point laces. "Man, this stuff's fiddly, isn't it? And heavy." "I'll get used to it." Papyrus hauled himself back onto his chair. The armor easily tripled his weight. He could handle it, but it wasn't exactly easy. "Thanks, Sans. I can get the rest." Sans returned to his own seat, pausing to brush the toast crumbs onto the carpet, as if that were any improvement at all. "Seriously, though," he said, "you seem kinda down, especially for a guy who just got his dream job and all. I must inquire about your mental well-being, bro." Papyrus threaded the leftover lengths of the arm straps out of the way. Even with the padding, he had to pull as tight as he could, and it still felt a bit loose. It would have to do for now. "It's a lot more responsibility than just being a sentry, Sans." The gauntlets were too big as well, but if he wore his gloves underneath, they were workable. Sans frowned at him, and cleared his figurative throat. And Squire?" They stared at each other for a few seconds. "Because I helped you with your armor?" The light in Sans' eye sockets glowed a little brighter. "Nothing?" "Oh, right," Papyrus said. "That's terrible. I have no brother, etc." He stood and gathered up his helm. Now seemed like a good time to go on patrol. Faster than Papyrus expected, Sans moved between him and the door. "Why won't you tell me what's eating you?" Tension pulled at the edges of his smile. He was badly failing to hide his worry. "Nothing is," Papyrus said, guilty and annoyed. "I'm fine. I'm just tired." He tried to push past his brother, but Sans slapped his hand away from the doorknob. "Sans!" "No, listen," Sans said, planting his back against the door. "You're acting really off, and it's weirding me out. We're family. We don't..." He faltered for a moment, gaze darting away for a split second. "We don't keep things from each other. So I'll ask again. What's going on with you?" Papyrus met his brother's concerned glare, and some tiny, over-tightened screw in his mind suddenly stripped out. "Oh, that's rich. So I'm supposed to be peppy and cheerful all the time, am I? I'm not allowed to have a bad day?" Sans blinked, caught off guard by Papyrus's blow-up. "Bro?" "You're the one who sleeps 12 hours a day. You're the one who stumbles around unwashed and half-dressed all the time." Papyrus was aghast at his own words, but now that the dam had burst, he couldn't stop himself. "You don't do anything unless I physically shove you outside, and even then you put forth the absolute minimum effort you can get away with. Something's wrong with me?" Sans wasn't barricading the door now so much as he was leaning on it to stay upright. His mouth worked, but no words were coming out. Papyrus couldn't get the words to stop. He was coming to a realization about his brother in the worst way possible, and he couldn't make himself stop talking. "When's the last time you washed those clothes? When was the last time you showered? Do you even remember? You smell like wet dog hair and feet." God, why was he being so cruel? Why couldn't he just shut up? "I'm the one with the problem. You can't even..." "No. You refuse to take care of yourself. You refuse to take anything seriously. You think I want to drag you along by the wrist for the rest of our lives? You think I want to be the one keeping you going day in and day out? I should be asking what's wrong with... I should..." Why had he never asked if Sans was okay? He was the worst, most selfish person in the world. "Please, stop," Sans said, barely a whisper, but Papyrus had already run out of steam. The house felt very small. Sans wouldn't look at him, and Papyrus needed to go. Now. He said. "I need to start my patrol." Sans didn't move, just allowed himself to be pushed along in front of the door when Papyrus opened it. He stepped away only when he had to avoid falling over. "Yeah," he said, eyes gone dim and flickering. "Guess I should get ready for work anyway." "No, you should stay home today." Papyrus jammed his helm on, one less piece that didn't quite fit. At least the visor slit was in the right place. "Better you fall asleep here than at your station," he added, unnecessarily. At any other time, a comment like that would have been normal brotherly sniping. But after that, it amounted to a final blow when he should have been merciful. He didn't shut the door after himself, wholly focused on just putting some distance between them as quickly as possible. He could feel his brother's stare on his back until the house was out of sight. "Wow, looking sharp, Papyrus." Papyrus bit down on a frustrated scream. Of course Flowey would pop up as soon as he crossed the bridge out of town. Of course he'd lead with the same compliment Papyrus had heard over a dozen times on his way here, thoroughly ruining it forever. Though he hadn't taken a great deal of pleasure in the attention anyway. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because he still felt like the scum of the underground after his altercation with Sans that morning. All the praise and well-wishing rang hollow. As if to twist the knife deeper, Flowey said, "So, I couldn't help but overhear you reading your brother the riot act earlier." Papyrus frowned. That was none of Flowey's business, and while he wasn't surprised, it was deeply unsettling to know that he was being watched at home too. "That's between my brother and me," he said. "If you ask me," Flowey said, ignoring him completely, "you are completely in the right. It wasn't my place to say anything, but I've thought for a long time now that he takes advantage of your kind nature." He bobbed on his stem. "Not that I think he means to, don't get me wrong, but the guy has some serious issues, don't you think? Maybe he'll do some thinking thanks to your intervention." Yeah, Papyrus thought to himself. He'd do some thinking on what a jerk his brother was. "I don't know why I was acting like that," he said, more to himself than Flowey. "Once I got going, I couldn't stop. And the things I was saying were so mean." Flowey scoffed and looked up at him, brow raised. "A family isn't a family without a lot of pent-up resentment and bitterness, Papyrus. Relax." He brightened up again. "Besides, sometimes the truth only sinks in when it's harsh. Sad, but true. I'd think you of all people would get that, right?" Papyrus got it. That particular idea had been literally beaten into him over the last month. "Well, I won't keep you, guardsman Papyrus." Flowey giggled. He giggled an awful lot. Papyrus was beginning to really dislike the sound of it. "Don't worry about it too much, okay? It's his problem that he's wasting his life, not yours. Oh," he said, "and don't forget our practice tonight, huh? Wear your armor." And then he was gone. Papyrus slumped, blowing out the breath he'd been holding. His plate felt even heavier now, pressing him down into the snow. He rolled his shoulders, trying to get the weight distributed more evenly. The extra layer of padding wasn't much of a substitution for muscle and fat. Still, the physical discomfort of 60 pounds of ill-fitting armor wasn't enough to distract him from his real troubles. He needed to figure out what Flowey wanted out of all this so he could make it stop. All he'd wanted was to get into the guard. With that done, what was the point of continuing? Unless Flowey just enjoyed beating on him for its own sake. But Flowey was a child, wasn't he? He'd been a child for a long time, true, but he'd been through such horrible things, and he'd been alone for so long. Perhaps he just didn't know how to behave. Maybe he could talk with Flowey tonight. It might not get him anywhere, but he was at a loss for what else to do. They couldn't go on like this. Flowey wasn't being a very good friend, and whatever the reason for that was, something had to change. It would be scary to stand up to him, but Papyrus had to try. Papyrus had never been so unhappy in his life, and his unhappiness was starting to spill over onto the people he cared about. He didn't want that. He didn't want to hurt anyone.